You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. I don't talk in real life about having hoarding disorder, so I talk about it on this podcast instead. And because I'm anonymous, I can talk really, really honestly. Subscribe to the podcast and find my social media links, episode transcripts, and every link that I mention at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. Hey, how are you? I am somehow at episode 150 of this podcast. It's kind of mind-blowing when I think about it. Thank you so much for your support in helping me get this far. It means a lot to me that it means something to you, so thank you. In episode 100, I talked about 19 things I'd learnt about hoarding. So today, for episode 150, I thought I'd do similar but opposite. I thought I would go through some of the terrible advice that we all hear about hoarding. And there's a lot of it about. I asked you on my social medias what terrible advice you kept hearing, and I got quite a list, and I added my own things to that list. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about bad advice and why it's bad. So the first bit of terrible advice you're sick of hearing is some variety of just get rid of it. Just throw it out. Just throw everything away. And the problem with this bit of advice is that it just really underestimates why we haven't been able to do that so far. You would think people would realise that if it was as simple as just throwing it all out, we would have already just thrown it all out. If we could, we would. The problem with this kind of advice is it just doesn't take into account that people who hoard have maybe maladaptive, maybe irrational, but still very real emotional attachment to the stuff around us. It can have significance and meaning to us in a way that people who don't hoard just do not get. It doesn't take into account that while it may not be rational, the feelings are still there and we can't just override them at will. Otherwise, we would have already done so. The other problem with just throw it all out is it's a very drastic and overwhelming approach that anybody who hoards may well react to with absolute fear and anxiety. It is a all or nothing solution. It is a nothing solution, isn't it? That just doesn't match the kind of pace that generally needs to be followed if a solution is to have long-term positive impacts rather than just an immediate clearance of space. The next thing that people say that is inappropriate hoarding advice is, it's just stuff. It's not important, it's just stuff. You don't need any of this stuff, it's just stuff. And again, the problem with this is that it avoids looking at the fact that for the person who hoards, it's not just stuff. For the person who hoards, it might be insurance against future poverty. For the person who hoards, it might be physical protection against a dangerous world. For the person who hoards, it might be nostalgia and beautiful memories. For the person who hoards, it might be something they feel defines their identity. If somebody is saying it's just stuff, that kind of swipes all of that significant meaning away. And like I said, I'm not saying that meaning holds up to scrutiny. I'm not saying there aren't irrational elements of it. But if we feel it this strongly, it has to be respected and looked at rather than just dismissed out of hand. The next bit of advice that somebody told me they hear and hate is you need to get rid of things that don't spark joy. And I would add to that any kind of trite advice that might work for somebody with a couple of extra bags of stuff rather than a house full of stuff. It's just very, very simplistic. And for people with hoarding disorder, which is a really complex and messy disorder, and I use that word advisedly, when a scrap of paper can hold an immense amount of significance, when a t-shirt isn't just a t-shirt, it's a way of remembering how proud of yourself you felt when you worked in the job where that t-shirt was the uniform. First of all, for hoarders, possessions spark a lot of things. Joy may be one of them, pain may be another, but trying to apply a system that is designed for people who need to do a bit of decluttering, trying to apply that to somebody with a complex mental health problem just isn't appropriate, in the same way as saying to somebody with OCD with a focus on contamination, oh, just wash your hands and you'll be safe. Or the same way as it's offensive to say to somebody with depression, just go for a walk, you'll be all right. In the same way, it's just not right or helpful to say to somebody who hoards, oh, just keep it if it sparks joy, get rid of it if it doesn't spark joy. It's simplistic, and it doesn't take into account that things may spark joy for us, but we may still need to get rid of them. Just sit with that for a minute. What if everything sparks joy? We can't keep it all. So that advice is problematic on two levels. One, it's overly simplistic. Two, it implies that if something sparks joy, we keep it. And as hoarders, we may need to be more discriminating than that. The next bit of advice that I'm sure we've all heard is just stop being lazy. You're being lazy, you're being weak, you're being selfish. I appreciate, without question, that it's really hard for the people around hoarders to live with us. We're not easy in that respect. But by blaming us in this way that says that we're doing it because we're lazy or selfish, it's not helpful. It's also not true. I've done an episode on why the idea that we hoard because we're lazy is a myth. I will link to that in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. But it's not true that our houses are like this because we're lazy. But also, if you take that approach with somebody who hoards, like, the problem is you're lazy, this reinforces shame that person almost certainly already feels, and makes us feel even worse as people. And the worse you feel about yourself and the lower your mental health slides, the less equipped you are to then sort out your home. Shaming somebody is not an effective way to produce long-term change. Well, long-term positive change in them. Shaming somebody is a fairly effective way of producing long-term negative effects on their mental health. It's not a good way of producing long-term positive effects on their mental health or their behaviour. And if we're constantly told we're lazy, we're messy, it discounts the fact that this is a pretty serious illness. And it makes us feel even more like we are terrible people. It's not that we don't shout at ourselves for being lazy and weak and selfish and messy. Most of us do. And it hasn't fixed us. It's probably made us worse. The next thing that people who hoard hear that is unhelpful is you should be embarrassed. You should be ashamed. Now, I can only really speak for myself, but I am. I am embarrassed. I am ashamed. And neither of those things has made me not hoard. Both of those things have probably exacerbated my existing tendency to hoard. It is counterproductive to shame people, and the more we shame people, the less able people are to seek help, because if we're always being told how disgusting we are, that makes it harder to go to somebody else and lay out precisely how we're disgusting. I say this from painful experience. Shame is the core reason I didn't tell anybody about hoarding for years. And so piling more shame and humiliation and you should be embarrassed on people, it doesn't do what you think it's going to do, and it may well make it worse. The next bit of bad advice we could all do without came from somebody on Instagram who was told, just get a skip. Just get a skip. And getting a skip, if you feel that's an appropriate solution for you, brilliant. They can be an excellent way of doing things. But that's a solution you have to come to yourself. This person had already filled several skips and found that the time pressure, because the skip is collected at a certain time, having already filled several skips, the time pressure of having another skip when the obvious stuff to go to the tip had already gone in the first few skips, just felt too much pressure. It created anxiety, and for them, it wasn't the simple solution that the person giving that advice felt it was. Another problem that I think people who hoard might face with the advice, just get a skip, is that a skip is quite a public way to get rid of your stuff. It's out in the street and all your possessions, whether treasured or not, are out there for anybody to see. And for people who hold on to our stuff very closely, often don't let people in our homes, having it on public display like that, I would imagine could, depending on your way of seeing your stuff, feel really, really difficult. For some people, it's the perfect solution, but it's not great advice to give to somebody, especially out of context. The next bit of terrible advice is, if you don't clean up, I'll clean up for you. I'll do it when you're out. I'll do it when you go away for the weekend. Oh no, please don't do this to hoarders in your life. As a threat, and that is how it feels, as a threat, that would create mistrust and anxiety on a degree that I think someone who isn't a hoarder just couldn't understand. It doesn't take into account that whether the third party likes it or not, this is the hoarder's stuff, and they, if at all possible, should have autonomy over what happens to it. If you want to maintain trust in a relationship, never go behind a hoarder's back and throw away everything, or even one thing. It will just backfire, probably quite spectacularly. It breaks a person's trust, and given that people who hoard tend to have very often been through an awful lot of trauma and grief already in their life, somebody sneaking in and throwing away their things that feel like a protection to some degree or other, ripping that away against their will just create mistrust and reinforce to that person that nothing and nobody is safe and the only thing they can rely on is their stuff. And if this happens and they're traumatized by it, what's their trauma response? We know the answer. Their trauma response is to surround themselves with more stuff. Another bit of advice that we hear quite often that isn't generally helpful is, why don't you just have a yard sale? Why don't you just have a car boot sale? Why don't you just sell it? Where to start? I have so much stuff. Which bit would I load up into the car boot to sell at a car boot sale? And now, let me explain car boot sales for international people. It seems to be quite similar to what Americans would call a yard sale, but instead of setting up in your front garden or on the street, you go to a car boot sale where there are, depending on the size, a few or dozens and dozens of people who open their car boot, which is the trunk, and sell their stuff from there. You might put up a table, but generally it's a car park on a Sunday morning, and you show up and you pay £5, and then you can sell whatever's in your car boot. So if I was to go to a car boot sale, which bit of my excess would I sell? Whatever I could fit into my car would be a fraction of the excess I've got. Now, following my own advice, I do have to admit that we have to do it bit by bit, and that what's the point in doing it because it's only a small fraction doesn't really stand up when you think about it all is just going to be small fractions until it makes the whole. However, the problem with this advice, on top of it just feeling like a drop in the ocean, is that car boot sales and yard sales can be quite brutal. And if this is your stuff that you have cherished in some way or another for years, and you rock up at a car boot sale and you try to sell it for £5 and everybody just wants to give you £1 for it, that can feel pretty difficult. Like a lot of this advice, telling someone to just sell it, just stick it on eBay, just have a yard sale, just have a car boot sale, oversimplifies the cause of the problem, because the problem is not each individual bit of stuff. The problem is a profound mental health problem that makes those of us afflicted with it believe that this is the way we stay safe, that this is the way we buffer the big bad world and keep it one step away from us. And reducing all of the complexity of this weird illness to, well, you might make 20 quid at the car boot sale. It feels very dismissive, and it doesn't feel like a solution, however much the person suggesting it believes it is. If you're enjoying the podcast, if you're learning new things, and if you want to show your support, you can become a De-Hoarding Darling. De-Hoarded Darlings get exclusive access to extra insights, recommendations, a Spotify De-Hoarding playlist, and additional answers from interviewees. Find out everything you need to know at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/darling. The next bit of terrible advice is just declutter one room a day. Or even just declutter one room a week. That you'll be done in a month or 2 months. Oh, my sweet summer child. I think that is underestimating not just the amount of stuff most of us have to do, but the difficulty level of doing it. Even, as I talk and as you listen, some of us have more stuff than others. Some of us have a lot of the hoarding thinking, but have managed to keep the amount of stuff low. Some of us have absolutely jam-packed homes. But whichever of those is your situation, even if you have like a reasonably presentable home, saying just do a room a week or a room a day underestimates the thinking and the decision making and the emotional reactions to that decision making. And while it sounds like a nice idea, surely you could do a room a week. Let's forget a room a day, that's ridiculous. But surely you could do a room a week. I wish that was true. I have been at this for far too long, and I still have such a long way to go. But I have 2 jobs. I have friends who I like to see sometimes. Occasionally, I like to go out into the countryside. Even if I had all the time in the world, and I do not have all the time in the world, because on top of those things I just mentioned, I've got a podcast. Even if I had all the time in the world, that's an unrealistic time expectation. It adds a lot of pressure. It makes you feel like a failure when you can't sort out a room per week. It underestimates, like all of this advice, underestimates the challenge, the complexity, and the confusing things that getting rid of stuff brings up for us, some of which is expected and some of which is not expected. Another bit of terrible advice, and this came from Jan, as in Jan said, here's some terrible advice, not Jan giving this advice to me. I need to be clear about that. Jan is not the kind of person who comes in with trite advice. So the terrible advice that Jan said this is terrible advice about, just to be absolutely clear, is you just have to create 3 piles. And it made me laugh because we have all heard this. You have 1 pile for keep, 1 pile for giveaway, and 1 pile for throwaway. And again, a bit like the spark joy advice, that can be great advice for people with a small amount of clutter and no maladaptive response to the stuff around them. And it can be part of the story for people who hoard. It can be part of the bigger picture. But as standalone advice, it ignores why we've ended up in this position in the first place. Because if we could see stuff that simply and act on it that straightforwardly, we would have done so years ago. Next bit of terrible advice that people reported is try harder. Just push. Just push. You can do it. Try harder. And the thing is, I'm increasingly understanding that we can't give 100% of the time. It is virtually impossible to do that without burning out, and burning out dramatically and not touching anything for 3 years in your home. We need to give differing levels of effort to this thing at different times because it's a long-term endeavour. We are not doing a one-off clear out of the kitchen cupboards, for instance. We're not going, right, I'm going to get on top of this dressing table and get all the old makeup out. We are trying to address probably a very full home where some proportion of the stuff in that very full home will invoke deep, confusing, powerful emotions in us. And we don't always even know when that will happen. I might say, I'm not going to address that box yet because I know it's got emotional letters in there from people who've died and I don't want to have to think about that. I'm not in the emotional space for it. And that can be useful, but that doesn't account for the things I come across accidentally that have that same powerful emotional effect on me that I wasn't anticipating because I didn't know it was there, for instance. So I really am starting to believe, first of all, that we can't try 100% of the time. And secondly, that at times when it looks like we're not trying at all, there's something else going on. Maybe we've been trying really hard for ages and we need a break. Maybe we are overwhelmed and don't know where to start. Maybe we are scared. Maybe we don't know how. Maybe any of these things. And so when it looks like we're not trying, it's not usually that simple. It's usually that there's one of a number of complex and confusing things going on for us. And we need a break because this is a marathon and not a sprint. I feel like I've said that on the podcast 1,000 times, but that's because it's true. Some people can run marathons, and that's an incredible feat. And occasionally somebody comes along like Eddie Izzard and runs, 25 marathons in 25 days, something like that. And we see that as a beyond incredible feat. But there's a reason the vast majority of us don't do that. Even when it doesn't look like we're trying, we might be processing stuff in our heads. We might be building up to something that looks more like effort, but all the effort currently is going on those mental processes. I think in most cases, in some way or another, we're trying as hard as we can. That just doesn't always look like vast amounts of stuff leaving the house, much as we may want it to. And the final bit of advice that we hear a lot and is really frustrating is basically anything with the word just in it. Think of all the things I've just talked about. Just get rid of it. Just throw it all out. It's just stuff. You just need to get rid of everything that doesn't spark joy. You're just lazy. Just get a skip. Why don't you just have a car boot sale? Why don't you just declutter a room a day? Why don't you just create 3 piles? And I'm going to add a bonus one to this list because it's not quite advice, but it's something we all probably hear a lot. And that's the people who say, oh, we've all got a bit of a hoarder in us. You know, when people have a slightly messy kitchen and go, I'm such a hoarder. I think it's becoming rightly recognised that it's not appropriate to say that somebody is a little bit OCD because they like their desk to be tidy, because that's really dismissive of a very serious mental health condition. I think we need to be thinking similarly with hoarding. When somebody says, I'm such a hoarder because they've got 3 pairs of jeans, it's really dismissive of the fact that hoarding is not just about having too much stuff. It's certainly not about having a minor amount of extra stuff or having a slight mess. Hoarding it affects so many areas of our emotions and our thinking that we end up living in unmanageable homes and not knowing what to do about it and not being able to do anything about it, some of the time at least. So if you are not actually somebody who actually hoards, do reconsider saying, oh, I'm such a hoarder, when you've just got a mild mess. Because we don't say, oh, I've got such cancer when we have a cold. So what pieces of advice do you hear that you wish you didn't? What pieces of advice do you get about your hoarding that are either useless or counterproductive? Let me know on social media or email me at info@overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Shout out this week to the Rethinking Wellness podcast. Have a listen to guest Alan Levinovitz talking about ambiguity or bewilderment.
There was something recently, actually, to end with on ambiguity. I called it bewilderment. So there's an essay I wrote called In Praise of Bewilderment for the Hedgehog Review, in which I just talk about how having a little bewilderment in your life is like having a little bit of spandex in your jeans. It means that when things change, you can adjust rather than ripping, and makes you more resilient. So that's a good place to start.
I kind of love that way of looking at life. How can we introduce a bit more bewilderment into our day? Okay, thanks for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to that Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast. And as hoarders, we may need to be more discriminating than that.